Room. Record. All right, recording in progress. Um, Before I dive into the major thrust of today's topic, I'm going to say a couple things that address some of the conversation from earlier, starting with Daniel Garner of OG Rose. Um, OG Rose is a two-person operation. Really quick here, I'm gonna probably lose service for a second as I switch Wi-Fi's. So let's go to I'm outside now, so it's nice outside. The only drawback to being outside once it's all uh, connected here is that I don't have the whiteboard. But if we can do this without that, then fine. If we can't, for whatever reason, we'll end up having a conversation. After today's lecture is the a conversation that will be recorded that is about the left's response to Charlie Kirk anthology. I think the current title of that anthology is On the Left's Response to Charlie Kirk. And that's at noon Pacific time. Is that right, Ann?
Yeah, I think
She
so.
probably. Oh, okay, cool. Perfect. Well, all right. So, anyway, saying something about the OG Rose writing thing, I wanted to just say, listening to Alex explain to Kevin what it is that they're all about is kind of illuminating. It's interesting because as I've gotten to know them as a couple, but especially Daniel, um, not just through reading their books, but also the amazing conversations that we've had on the channel. Um, I've I've thought a lot about why it is that there's some kind of a working relationship between what it is we're doing and what they're doing. Like it's very strange because to me, nothing they're doing, if you just describe it, feels like it directly pertains to most of the stuff that TU is doing. And in fact, for like the first year that I was aware of the work that they're doing on the internet, none of it looked like anything that really related to what I was doing. And so I never really reached out to them, never really talked to them because it just looked like they were having conversations with any and all intellectuals in the underground with some kind of maybe religious motivation. And I was like, well, I don't really care about that. I don't really see what they're doing. But there's there's so many things that have come out since uh, Daniel really showed himself to me as a serious thinker. Um, and so I'll just say what that is, what he has shown me, and use that as a springboard into today's lecture. But it was when he wrote an article on my book Timenergy. Daniel Gardner was the first person to write a serious review of my work, and it wasn't just a review; it was also a thinking with. Like he was showing some serious uh, thought, thinking with the concept of time energy. And I was impressed. And there was this part of me, and I'm just gonna be completely honest with you guys. Like there was this part of me at first that was just like, why is it Daniel? Why does it have to be Daniel who's the first person to seriously engage with my work? Because he's kind of just like if you're just passing by stuff and you don't really take the time to listen to him, he comes off as a really hyper, kind of guy. He's real hyper, and I'm like, he just gets excited about stuff, but he gets excited about stuff that isn't really in my wheelhouse and doesn't, and it just feels all like religious shit. So who cares? And so I was just like, why is he engaging with my stuff? But of course, I hadn't read his work, and I'd only really seen clips of him on Instagram because Michelle posts clips of their conversations, and those clips are always, them dialoguing with other people. So I was way less aware of the fact that what they're doing is a profound critique of sociology, as well as a profound critique of theology from the standpoint of a philosophical way of life. So they are living quite philosophically, and on that basis, critiquing actually existing Christians as well as the actually existing sociologically informed, I would say, left. Though primarily, um, it doesn't come off as a critique of the left. It comes off as a sort of call of conscience to the right.
Mm.
That Daniel's work in particular um, can't really be understood without thinking he's trying to influence Christians and conservatives. Uh, I don't know if he's trying to influence the entire movements or whatever, but he's definitely kind of thinking of people who, for instance, care about belonging. You don't write a book called Belonging Again for uh, secular theorists of a progressive vein, because progressive theorists today just they generally are against the ideas of belonging. They see belonging as some kind of ideology, especially if you're a white person. You know, you're talking about belonging. They overthink it, and what they fail to see is that humans do have this deep need for belonging. But that's something that conservatives have no problem acknowledging. They want to have a world in which they can belong. And so OG Rose engaging with the idea of belonging is illuminating for a lot of reasons. But in particular, he does come at it from the level of ideology critique and of the critique of capital. And so one of the pieces in Underground Theory Volume 2 that's coming out really soon is called I think it's just On Capital, and it's by Daniel Garner. And he also has a piece in there on his engagement with Timenergy. And so, you know, the two best pieces on Capital and Timenergy in the upcoming volume are by Daniel, which is really cool. Um, but then before I segue that into the lecture for today, I just want to say, yeah, he is trying to kind of reform conservative Christians, right? He's trying to show them that they lost the plot a long time ago, that the true religious fidelity to the Christian ideal has nothing to do with dogmatic uh, 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 lists of of concluded interpretations that were supposedly handed down to us, and then we're just supposed to accept them and live them out. He takes Christianity up as a mode, a mode of relation to power. He interprets faith as a commitment to courageous action in the face of an uncertainty. You know, so there's a lot of stuff there that he is able to achieve by taking the cataphatic idea of Christianity and then opening it up to a more apophatic sort of ideal. But in doing so, I want to contrast that with Benjamin Studebaker, who's not doing that with Christians or conservatives, but is instead doing the exact same thing for the left. Both of them are sort of archetypical fellow travelers of TU, archetypical interlocutors of my own project, who are committed to things that I'm not committed to. Benjamin committed to the left, Daniel committed to Christianity. Um, Benjamin committed to leftism. Uh, Daniel, to some extent, committed to some kind of conservatism. So they're both committed to these things, but specifically in the way of reform. They believe that these things are so far gone, but the only way to make any sort of real progress in the world, their own best path to making some kind of impact, being to adhere to what they take to be the true ideals of these different movements, and then on the basis of those true ideals, to be a sort of voice of conscience um, to those movements. And so I think that that's really interesting because as a sort of post-left, critical, philosophical school of thought, Theory Underground doesn't have a lot of allies, and there's not a lot of people out here doing the kinds of work that I think needs to be done. But when there are people doing that work, the closest we can find of anyone doing it, especially rigorously, doesn't come from people who have cut ties to or burnt bridges with the left, or cut ties to and burnt bridges with Christianity, but it specifically comes from people who are looking at the foundations of those bridges and then getting rigorously informed into their historicity, into the fundamental values that inform those worldviews. And then they are looking to, from that basis, reform those things. And so, as a sort of post left, post Christian, post religious, secular, critical thing, it's interesting to think that our number one allies and fellow travelers aren't going to agree with us at that level. They'll probably agree with us a lot about the fact that these things need to be critiqued and that these things need to be changed. But instead of being like, uh, 20th century, early 20th century leftists and just assuming that Christianity will wither away as the socialist state rises to power, they instead say, well, we might actually have to work with this thing that has some kind of staying power and is probably not going to just go away because we think it's so outdated. And then the same thing being said about the left. So I'm not sure about all that. I could see any person involved with TU, including myself, someday changing positions on any one of these things and going from being post left to going back to being left or going right or something like that. But to me, it's not about identity. It's about what are you doing? What do you feel compelled to do? So my identity is not post left. I think that's a stupid identity. The podcasters who identify as post left are annoying, right? It's like you're not post anything. You just don't explicitly fanboy for leftists. That doesn't mean that your fundamental operating assumptions are no longer left. And more importantly, you might be atheistic or secular, but that doesn't mean that your fundamental operating assumptions aren't themselves informed by some kind of secularized or secularizing ideas or mode inherited from Christendom, right? So it's like we think that we're free of something or we're so post something, and in being so over that, so beyond it, we actually don't realize how much we are still a sort of slave to its tenets. And so for me, I'm not going to assume I'm post anything really at the level of identity, but it's more of just a way of trying to articulate in my mode, I'm not committed to centering, catering to, or prioritizing assumptions, tenets, values, or interlocutors who are X, Y, or Z identities, right? And so anybody who saw the exchange that I had with Cleo Carnes on Substack recently might be aware of kind of what I'm getting at. But in this, she basically challenges something that I said. Uh, she's basically saying that I'm not engaging with the left seriously enough on the race issue. Um, she makes a bunch of assumptions about how much I do or do not do that. Um, I basically was like, I've not only read all of these thinkers that you're referencing, and many more than that, but also they just don't pertain to what I'm saying. They all existed before the problems that we're dealing with today that I'm pointing out, and yeah, I'm not a leftist, and so I'm not trying to cater to or influence or change the left. And then she, in her response, which got increasingly respectful, it was more and more respectful as we went back and forth. Um, she still was like trying to say that I have to engage with the left in a certain way, or I have to try to, you know, whatever. Basically, cater to, center, and prioritize the left, its assumptions, its goals, its frameworks. And the thing is that's a totally valid project for her if what she's looking to do is to reform this idea of the left or some kind of a movement that could be described as left. And that's a totally valid thing to do. But what people don't realize is like what I'm trying to do is not influence uh, people committed to something like that. You can be committed to something like that or not. The real question is, do we come together and actually benefit one another in our inquiry into trying to understand the situation today? Like, that's really what matters. Are we able to, through dialogue, come into a better understanding of our situation today? And I think that working with and talking to people who have fundamental, even dogmatic commitments, it is never a fruitless task, or at least rarely a fruitless task. Because when human beings have commitments, when they take certain things as given, as Daniel Gardner would say, when they have a certain set of givens, that means that they're actually able to see things that those of us lacking those givens, not taking those things for granted, might not ourselves be able to see, right? I'm not able to see what you're able to see if you have certain commitments. In the same way that, you're able to see things that I'm not able to see if you come from a different sort of background, right? So that's all, part of why I do work with people who, at a sort of surface level, perhaps disagree with me, or it's also why I end up working with people or talking to people that makes it so that people assume that I agree with those people when I actually don't, right? And so people will assume that I'm doing some kind of Christian conservative project because I talk to someone like Daniel, or they will assume that I'm still some kind of lefter than thou leftist trying to influence the left by saying, well, the real left would be like this and the real left would be like that, because I talk to people who are doing that. And so it's a difference between like a commitment to a certain set of beliefs and instead a commitment to a dialogue with people representing a lot of different beliefs. Right. And because most people only get a little bit of it here and a little bit of it there, most people, they're not really able to take in that whole picture I just described. Now, the segue into today's topic is really about understanding and theorizing our situation, and doing so in the midst of a world where all of the tools that we have for understanding that situation have come to us from people who have a fundamentally different mode in that situation. What do I mean? I'm talking about workers as opposed to academics. I'm talking about being being or doing things for workers with earbuds, but using concepts that come from a certain mode of life that is foreclosed to those workers with earbuds, and trying to figure out like what it is that we're going to do with that. And I said in the email that went out a couple days ago that I'd be building off of the idea of, or the ideas developed in my last seminar. And so that's kind of what I want to first touch on. What was it that we were talking about in the last seminar? Well, it was mostly me giving a lecture about what is it that we're doing here, and does it mean that we need to be holding ourselves to the standards or expectations of traditional academia? In particular, this idea that what we're doing is only really worthwhile if it includes homework, right? And I was trying to sort of give a pep talk for those who feel guilty for not doing homework related to the stuff that we're covering here. I talked about the incentives, the objective incentive structures that come from the fields that all academics have to navigate. I talked about how in order to get a PhD or a master's like I have, right, you have to have been able to prioritize the interests of other people, the mandates of others, in a way that most people obviously are not able to. Now, of course, there is like this assumption that, well, it's really a matter of intelligence and just not everyone is intelligent enough. But also, and to some extent that's true, but also there is the fact that uh, you might you might be an intelligent person, but the kind of intelligence you have is to some extent dependent on actually uh, caring about the thing that you're studying. And so you just weren't able to force yourself to study things that you were not immediately interested in. And that's kind of the worker with earbuds I always assume, because it's kind of the worker with earbuds I kind of was before I burnt out on work and tried to go the academic route for a while. Right? Not to say that I ever was done with work. I was never done. I was always working my way through college. But the uh, the idea is that life itself is not going to be worth living if I have to keep focusing on what other people want me to focus on. So I'd rather work a mundane job where at least my mind is freed to think about what I want to think about, right? And that this is almost like a fundamental difference between wage work, most wage work, and most of the kinds of email jobs, like Matthew Stanley always calls them fake email jobs. The fake email jobs, or the desk jobs, or the white collar jobs, or we could say the PMC kind of jobs, they require focusing on things for throughout your day. That, some of these require a lot of deep focus, whereas other ones require a lot of focus on a lot of different things. So you're bouncing around between all those different things throughout the day. Like a basic management job requires a lot of bouncing around between a lot of different things throughout the day, whereas some professions require large amounts of deep focused time. But in either case, that focused attention is being directed towards something that relates to your livelihood, which is to say, like your income, your salary. And that this ability to focus on something that is not free from the dictates of your livelihood, um, it's a privilege, it's a luxury, it comes from a kind of leisure that I don't think most workers experience, but I also would say most white collar jobs also are not able to experience, and I think to increasing extents, these white collar jobs are unable to do so. I say increasing because back in the day, the further back you go, the more likely it was that you could find people uh, who were academics or monks, and they were able to, for the most part, meditate on what they were um, called to meditate on, and that was less about a profession. Whether this be uh, Thomas Aquinas or Rene Descartes as a couple of archetypical examples, we're talking about people who are able to not just focus, but devote themselves to an object of study or a field, and to do so for its own sake. Both of them had to some extent, think about where there were things that they had to do, such as court patrons. Descartes in particular, as a sort of underground Renaissance man, he definitely had to court patrons. Whereas Aquinas, if I'm to understand correctly, didn't really have to. Like, he just did a good. It's less about courting patrons than it is about just keeping at least certain people within the church happy. But in both cases, those are obviously things that will also structure their ability to do the work that they're doing. And those being conditions of possibility for them being able to do that work, there will be givens which have trade-offs, right? There will be good things and bad things that come with those objective conditions of possibility for them being able to do that work, right? But what I'm trying to say is that it's harder and harder and harder for academics to have as much freedom as they did then. And I want to say one quick note about the idea, just as a sort of disclaimer, the idea of interests. Um, Interests informing one's research do not undermine that research. It can seriously undermine it, but it doesn't necessarily undermine it. Um, Conclusions that come from research that are it come from or driven by vested interests um, within or outside of oneself are not invalidated, but we do have to understand that there are these biases. And so I'll give a couple of examples, but first just say a sort of general um, fact, which is like a truth is a truth regardless of the motivations behind the person who discovers that truth, right? A truth is a truth regardless of the motivations of the person who discovers that truth. Okay, but with that said, it is also true that the overwhelming majority of research today comes from billionaires or from the state, which has obviously its own interests. So I have here a couple of quotes that I want to read that kind of help us get into that a little bit. Here we go. I'm going to read from a section of Disciplined Minds by Jeff Schmidt called Directing the Professor's Curiosity. He says, do university scientists freely set the courses of their own careers, or do outside forces lead them to enter particular subfields within their disciplines and to take up particular topics within those subfields? To ask the same question in a different way, how much freedom do those who fund scientific research give to those who do scientific research? The federal government sponsors the bulk of the basic science research that goes on in US universities. Most basic physics research at universities, for example, is sponsored by just 4 government agencies: the Department of Energy, successor to the Atomic Energy Commission, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Defense through the Army Research Office, the Office of Naval Research, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, and so on, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. 99% of the federal funding for basic physics research at universities comes through these 4 agencies. In 1998, the federal government spent about $590 million on university physics research. About $455 million of that expenditure paid for research characterized as basic. At the University of California, Irvine, my old school, physics professors in 1996 got 8.7 million of their 10.2 million in research and development money from the federal government. One of the things I really like about Jeff Schmidt's work, though I have a lot of problems with it that I don't feel the need to really get into today, I just kind of want to let you all know I do have issues with it. Maybe it's a little too leftist in some of its assumptions and ways of framing things. But what I really, really, really like about it, though, is that he, I think, was very aware that people all know social sciences and humanities are softer sciences, softer disciplines, that they are very malleable to rationalization, very susceptible to propaganda, to becoming vehicles of propaganda for pure ideology, right? That's already like everyone knows, right? So instead of using those kinds of examples, he turns to the hardest sciences that there are and focuses throughout the book on physics and talks about how ideological the vested interests driving physics research actually are. And of course, if you talk to a scientist, they're not thinking this way. Very rarely are they thinking this way. It's not common to find them thinking that like in a self-aware way, or admitting that they are working within the confines of state interests. But it's also not just the state interest. We're in the humanities, we're in the social sciences, and I actually have some really cool shit that I was able to pull up this morning that I wanted to touch on. I'm going to take it all with a grain of salt because I haven't chased it all down to um I haven't chased down all the sources yet. But let's take some of these that I was able to get and share. Here we go. Yeah, okay. Who funds the humanities and social sciences? So about 180 to 200 million is coming from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is government, right? The National Endowment for the Arts, and the NSF, the National Science Foundation, are huge, huge, huge contributors. But actually, the Ford Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and John D. and Catherine T. McArthur Foundations bring in way more than any of the government foundations. So these private foundations do a lot. And these private foundations, like the Ford Foundation or like the Bill Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they're huge, huge in the humanities and social sciences. When I'm talking about these different foundations, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into universities, museums, and K through 12 institutions. Okay. And so I just kind of wanted to do that extra little injection about the humanities and social sciences because Jeff Schmidt leaves that out of disciplined minds. I appreciate that he leaves them out because he does focus on the more hardcore sciences and the funding behind that. And then he kind of pulls back the veil and shows that even when it's seemingly completely innocuous research missions being sent out by these foundations, it's actually, go a couple steps deeper. It's being driven by questions coming out of or problems um, in the fields of military weapons development. And so, we have all these scientists thinking that they're just doing some kind of pure physics, but in reality, the funding their departments are chasing is coming from uh, weapons manufacturers, right? And he talks about how there's a filtering mechanism in play so that it's not like professors sell their souls. It's just that the professors who have interests that do not align with the military industrial complex's interests, those people don't make it through the filters, right? So it's not about, oh, these scientists have sold their souls. No, it's just that these scientists who make it through the filters, their souls are, or their interests are in such and such a way that makes it so that they can totally work within the narrow confines of this uh I'll just say through these objective incentive structures, right? Knowing where your funding comes from is a really big deal. Yeah. Okay. So in my seminar, I talked a lot about Skole versus schooling. It's been a theme at TU. I don't want to have to go over it too much, but just a really quick version of it is to say that schooling, when we say schooling as opposed to school, what we're getting at is the disciplinary, manipulative, mind closing, stultifying aspects of school, which is not to totalize school and say that that's all school is. There's also wonderful things going on at schools. There's amazing teachers at schools. There's really important big ideas still being taught in schools. But schooling is about what critical pedagogy calls the invisible syllabus. All right. But Skole is something different altogether. Skole is the Greek root of the word school. It's also the Greek root of the words scholar or scholastic. And school in this sense, means something very different than what most people experienced um, while being schooled. What did most people experience? Well, it wasn't Skole. So what is Skole? Um, if it's this root word of school, scholar, and scholastic. I've typically, in quick passing, simply referred to it as active leisure time. And it's obviously true that most of you did not experience school as leisurely, right? It wasn't leisurely. But I want to go a little deeper into this, though, and then we'll tie it into time energy theory and our situation that we find ourselves in and how our presuppositions that we've inherited from scholars and scholasticists and professors or academics don't necessarily benefit this new frontier, this emerging movement that we are ourselves pioneering. Right? They might, but they might not, and we should be on guard. So let's read a couple quotes here from uh, Pascalian meditations on Skole. And first of all, I'll just say that in all of my research and all my time doing the time energy topic in academia, I think the biggest tragedy in a sort of sense was that I didn't find Bourdieu sooner, or that in particular I didn't find the version of Bourdieu that I find to be the most fruitful for thinking about time energy theory. And that was because there was no professors. There were no professors in all of my time there who were Bourdieuian. And the only time I met people who were at all influenced by Bourdieu, it was just a sort of cringe appropriation to a kind of DEI identity politics that, they just kind of, they'd usually talk about like whiteness as a form of habitus, which is like, there's actually interesting stuff that can be done with that. But I think it's way blown out of proportion, and they're missing the true revolutionary thing that he's doing, which is not that. That's not what Bourdieu's doing at all. That's just how he's appropriated to sociology today. But I think that the most important work by Bourdieu is Pascalian Meditations, not Distinction, his supposed magnum opus, which is just called his magnum opus because it's a big fat book. He's got way better books than Distinction. There are several that I would recommend before Distinction, but in particular, Pascalian Meditations is his most succinct, mature engagement with philosophy, and in particular, a critique of the approach to philosophy, first really put forward in the most hyperbolic way possible by Rene Descartes in Descartes' Meditations, or later recapitulated by Husserl in his Cartesian Meditations, right? And so Pascalian Meditations plays directly off of uh, both Descartes and Husserl's meditations. But and what he does is he sort of turns it back onto the askers of the fundamental questions in those texts. So I don't have to do too much explanation of those works. I assume you're all a little familiar with Descartes' meditations, the I think, therefore I am, right? The hyperbolic doubt. Do I really exist? Does God really exist? Does the world really exist? Like, how do I know anything? We have to figure out a fundamental basis upon which to develop a system, and it has to be on a immutable, inarguable, undeniable sort of axiomatic first principle. And for him, the first principle was, well, I know I exist. I might not know that the world exists, but because I'm even questioning it, I know that I exist. Well, Husserl, as the father of phenomenology, takes that to a whole nother level in his work, The Logical Investigations, or his multi-volume work, The Ideas. But the best sort of short version of Husserl's recapitulation of that project can be found in his Paris lectures, right, where he actually does this Cartesian Meditations lecture, which had a huge influence on people. And sort of one of the French thing, and that lecture was given in Paris. It had a big influence on all the people who were influenced by Husserl and Heidegger, like, Sartre and Levinas and Derrida and Foucault, all of the, sort of uh, coffee drinking French intellectuals we think about from the 70s. It had a huge influence on them. It made them all, and I would throw Lacan into this as well. Think about like what comes before the thing that people think about. So what comes before the object of desire? The object cause of desire. Thanks, Lacan. What comes before writing? Arche writing. Thanks, Derrida. Right? They all do this what comes before maneuver. And it comes from a fundamental critique of all of the things that we take for granted, which in the 20th century was done best, or at least most famously, by Husserl. Heidegger takes it up and flips it on its head and says that actually before the thinking ego is the world itself. The world is more undeniable than the thinking ego, the cogitos ergo sum. And so, that's what Heidegger's being in time actually achieves in a sort of sense, is it takes on Heidegger, or sorry, Heidegger takes on Husserl by showing world comes before ego. But for Bourdieu, who was very influenced by both Husserl and Heidegger, his Pascalian meditations are not Cartesian and they're not Heideggerian. In fact, his Pascalian meditations are going to turn the tables on not just Husserl and Descartes, but also on Heidegger as well, by showing that the fundamental thing missed or taken for granted by intellectuals throughout history, but especially philosophers, the ones who are most responsible for understanding their priors, their givens, their preconceptions, their prejudices, is Skole. Skole is the number one thing. And before I get into what he means by Skole and why I think it's important to read some quotes from his book, I just want to say Skole for the last let's see, I almost 10 years has been in conversation with people whenever we're thinking about time energy, conflated with time energy in the same way that otium is conflated with time energy, in the same way that some people will conflate labor time or labor power with time energy. And so that is not what we're doing here. In fact, I think that by understanding what Skole is, we can contrast it to otium, the Latin word that is kind of similar but different. But also, we can contrast both Skole and otium with labor power, and through doing this, show that time energy is something separate prior to and the condition of possibility for all of these, right? But all of this also is important for thinking about ourselves, our situation, what it means to be underground thinkers, what it means to be within institutions today, between institutions in the underground today, or barred from the institutions and just based in the underground. What does it actually mean to be living a mode of life that does not have Skole, but nevertheless is getting its concepts from people who were in a mode that did have Skole, and usually in a sort of unconscious way or in a non-self-aware way. Bourdieu being the first great theorist who is doing this in a very self-aware way. Okay, and then the other note I have to say before I read those quotes is just that Pascal is a very marginal thinker in the history of ideas. Few people consider themselves Pascalians, right? Go ahead and raise your hands if you've ever seen anyone primarily refer to themselves or their work as Pascalian, right? I've personally never seen it, and I think Bourdieu is well aware that this is a sort of controversial thing to be, right? Because he's not considered to be like one of these towering thinkers on the level of Marx or Weber. And if Bourdieu in particular, as a sociologist, he's definitely surrounded by Marxists, Weberians, Durkheimians, etc. Right? So for him to say, people often ask me about the relation of my work to Marx. They're trying to get me to say how I am or am not a Marxist. What I tend to do, he says, is turn it on his head and say, well, actually, you see, I'm primarily a Pascalian. Okay, and so what does he mean by this? And so without going too deep into it, Pascal was, was he from the 15 or 16 or 1700s? I'm not even sure. I'm not personally a huge Pascalian. I have read a lot of his pensées, which are basically fragments of thought. Someone go ahead and let me know the date here. But it doesn't, it doesn't really matter. But let's go ahead and get the date figured out. He's kind of like Nietzsche in the sense that he's not an institutional creature. He's not making his whole way through the institution. You could kind of call him an underground thinker. But his pensées, like
One
Nietzsche's.
sec, Dave, just to contextualize, like you were asking for the dates, so
Yes,
it would
please,
be
thanks. Yeah,
17th century. He lived from
cool.
1623 to 1662.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Kevin. To 1662, you said? So 17th century, so 1600s. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, well, kind of like Nietzsche, he's an underground thinker, but also highly educated prior to debilitating illness, kind of forced him to not be a part of all that, which is also like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had debilitating illnesses that made it so that he was um, kind of incapable of staying in one spot. And the best way he could deal with his pain was to be on the move, which is why he would wake up at 6 a.m. and then spend most of the day hiking and then most of the evening dancing. Like he was all about movement because he had chronic pain. And the only real way to stay ahead of the pain was to stay moving. And the same thing is sort of true with Pascal. The only difference being it made it so he couldn't really move. So he's a lot more bedridden than Nietzsche. But it did make it so that he couldn't really navigate the institutional fields of his time. It made it so that his sort of autodidactic scholarly activities were something he just did in the miserable um, uh, leisure of his bedroom or study. And I say miserable just because he was chronically hurting. But he's commonly thought of as like a sort of Christian thinker. He was often engaging with the Christians of his time. He was obviously a Christian. He's often referenced for the Pascalian wager, which is where he basically says, oh well, if you're doubting the reality of Christianity, or at least of God's existence, you could always just do a wager, which is, like, what do you really have to lose? If it's wrong, you'll have just lived a more moral life. But if it is true and you weren't a believer, well, you're kind of risking eternal damnation. So obviously, you're going to come out the side of Christianity then. Now I'm really butchering it, but that is also still operative today. You've probably met Christians who kind of say something similar, right? This is a way of dealing with people who are doubting, is to try to use this kind of reasoning on them. And I think that we do Pascal a supreme injustice when we reduce him to that. That was just an idea, like a thought experiment that he had. It's not something that he published in his life. It's not one of his big main ideas. The big main idea for Pascal, if you really want to know who he is, and this is all the rest of what I have to say about Pascal for now, because this is why it relates to Bourdieu's Pascalian meditations. The big thing you should remember with Pascal is just that he does not think reason is the be all end all, or like the main thing for humans, or informing human life. Not only is it not the main thing, it's also just that he thinks real philosophy is doing its work the best when basically making fun of philosophy and philosophers. So making fun of philosophy and making fun of philosophers and kind of just showing the absurdity of people who think that they can reduce everything to the life of the mind and reason. That was very Pascalian. And so what Bourdieu's getting at is that his work as this kind of reflexive approach, it's meant to kind of turn the tables on intellectuals and show the absurdity of their position. And in particular, with Bourdieu, that means showing, oh guys, intellectuals, that we assume a lot. We're really good at critiquing the things that we, or at least our common culture assumes, but we're actually really, really bad at assuming the thing that we take the most for granted and the thing that comes as a direct product of our position in the relations of production, which usually makes it impossible to take seriously the actual mode of production itself. Skole is conditioned by most people staying preoccupied with necessary labor so that the intellectuals are able to have a freedom from and distance from necessary labor. That freedom from and distance from necessary labor becomes the condition of possibility for their skole, their active leisure. Now, we'll get into why people don't really have that anymore today, but first let's read some of the quotes that I said I was going to read. If you do have the Pascalian Meditations pulled up in front of you, lots of TU students have learned, since I don't tend to share the texts ahead of time, I might tell you, get it, but I don't really expect you to have done the reading ahead of time. But yeah, if you're listening to a lecture, it's a good habit to just go to Anna's archive and search for the text being talked about and pull it up for yourself, and you can download it, back it up to whatever drive folder you like to use, queue it up in Speechify so you can listen to it later that day, whatever. But yeah, if you have it pulled up, you'd go to page 10, which is in a section called The Critique of Scholastic Reason. And he says, now he's talking about the presuppositions of the scholar. He says these really of the philosopher. When he's saying philosopher or scholar in this context, he's really thinking of Descartes, Husserl, Heidegger, the main three people he's arguing with in various ways, explicitly and implicitly throughout the entirety of this work, the Pascalian Meditations. So he says, these presuppositions are of three different orders. To start with, the most superficial, there are those associated with occupation of a position in social space and the particular trajectory that has led to it, and with gender, which can affect the relationship to the object in many ways, inasmuch as the sexual division of labor is inscribed in social structures and in cognitive structures, orienting, for example, the choice of object of study. Right. And so, these are just the basic origin story things about you that make it so that you're doing what you're doing. Your gender is going to influence it probably to some extent, the neighborhood you were born in, some, things that you experienced at formative points in your own development, yada, yada, yada. So the first level, it's just stuff about you. And as he pointed out, this is the most superficial level. This is the level it's easiest for people to recognize, which is why American academics have no problem usually pointing out their privilege or their, oh, well, as a white male, it's more or less easy to do that kind of stuff because it's like, well, yeah, we all have particularities. And so you can seem very self-aware by pointing out those particularities and then saying that that must in some way influence your perspective, right? So he's saying that's obvious. That's easy. Okay, but there's deeper levels. So he says, then there are those that are constitutive of the doxa specific to each of the different fields: religious, artistic, philosophical, sociological, and more precisely, those that each particular thinker owes to his position in a field. Doxa is italicized here, and it just means common sense. It is the knowledge taken for granted within a field. That's going to be a lot harder for most people to see. If you're a pretty extreme outsider to a field, it might be a bit easier for you to see that people belonging to that field always seem to assume certain things. They always treat certain things as sacred. They always treat certain things as profane. They take certain things for granted, and there's other things that they can't seem to comprehend. It's a lot easier as an outsider to see that stuff. It's very hard for people within a field to see that stuff. Yeah. And so thinking about the occupation of a position within a field here is very powerful. And it's very important for socioanalysis. I mean, if figuring that out is like one of the most important things for socioanalysis. But then finally, he says, there are the presuppositions constituting the doxa generically associated with the skole, leisure, which is the condition of existence of all scholarly fields. Right? So we start out with particularities about you as an individual or as an individual belonging to a group. Then we move to the level of your individual field. And now we've zoomed out to the level of the one thing all of the fields take for granted is the condition of all of their possibility, and that is skole. Then he says, contrary to what is commonly said, especially when people worry about ethical neutrality, it is not the first set in particular religious or political prejudices which are hardest to apprehend and control, because they are attached to the particularity of persons or social categories and are therefore different from one individual to another, from one category to another. They are unlikely to escape the self-interested criticism of those who are driven by other prejudices or convictions. What he's getting at is that when there's something particular about you or your group or your field or its discipline within that field, the particularity of that actually doesn't go unnoticed because other people are able to or other fields are able to kind of like say why they're different than you, right? He's setting it up to say, yeah, the hardest thing to see is the thing that all of the fields share, right? The hardest thing to see is the one thing that they all take for granted, the one thing that makes them all common. That's going to be the hardest to recognize. Now I'm going to jump ahead to something on page 12. He says, but there is no doubt nothing more difficult to apprehend for those who are immersed in universes in which it goes without saying than the scholastic disposition demanded by those universes. There is nothing that pure thought finds it harder to think than skole, the first and most determinate of all the social conditions of possibility of pure thought, and also the scholastic disposition, which inclines its possessors to suspend the demands of the situation, the constraints of economic and social necessity, and the urgencies it imposes or ends it proposes. It's a lot. There's a lot going on there. And all I kind of want to point out is for Bourdieu, leisure is not just the opposite of moving your body. I've run into this with people where they think that your time spent in school was indeed leisurely because your body wasn't moving a lot. They think that leisure means sitting at a desk. That's not what it means here. That's not what it meant for great philosophers or social theorists of the last 2,500 years either. Skole instead, as a condition of supposedly pure thought, it's a scholastic disposition, which is removed from the constraints of economic and social necessity and the urgencies imposed by those, or the ends imposed by those. So think about what are the ends imposed by the social and economic conditions of one's time, right? Well, obviously, to some extent, what we're talking about is like having a job or like a source of income, having, job kind of is secondary. The most important thing here is having your house in order so that you're not stressing about for instance, paying rent or paying taxes, or where are you going to get food from, or who's going to wash the dishes. When we think of the great works throughout the history of the Western canon, I'm going to focus on the Western canon, though I do assume that this is all true of all other canons as well. But let's just focus on the Western one since it's closest to us. The thing that unites all these thinkers is that they had their economic and social conditions taken care of. Never entirely, which is why I brought up Aquinas and Descartes. One relied on the church, the other relied on patrons. But it was a known fact to the church as well as those patrons who were funding the Great Renaissance. It was a known fact that for an intellectual or creative type person to do what they were going to do, it required freeing them from necessity to do that. This has been lost. It's not just like working class people no longer have the ability to have this kind of skole. I mean, working class people never had this kind of skole, right? No, it's also white collar people, especially in academia, have also lost this because the patrons and the institutions that they are reliant on have also lost this basic thing that everyone else used to take for granted, which is that intellectual work is done best when freed from the social and economic pressures and obligations that everyone else is always tasked with, everyone else is always preoccupied by. So schooling isn't just leisure, because leisure is not enough to really understand what we're getting at. What we're getting at is a freedom from preoccupation with economic and social necessity. And that word, skole, is the root of school, of scholar, of scholastic. Yet you will not find a scholar or school where people are in a mode of, where people are in a general disposition that makes you go, yeah, that person really doesn't have to think about social and economic necessity. Part of the reason for that is the first question people ask you once they can start having real conversations with you as a little kid, they're going to ask you what you want to be when you grow up. And that's not any less true for rich kids. You can say, well, I want to run my dad's company. Well, yeah, but they're still going to ask you what you want to be when you grow up. Everything becomes instrumentalized by this idea of career or job. And that instrumentalization, though it's existing in all social realities, has reached new heights for us in a world where the patrons and institutions have seemingly forgotten about the necessary conditions of true scholarly activity, that being this freedom from preoccupation with necessary labor. Now, this brings us to the most important point, I think, of the lecture here. And that is the question of the relation between Timenergy and Skole. I said I was going to say the difference between otium and Skole and then juxtapose those to labor power and Timenergy, since people often get these all crossed up and they kind of just assume they're the same thing. Okay. And so the quick version of it is that otium is a Latin word for something like skole, but the difference between skole and otium is the connotation of otium was typically like resting, like actual resting, whereas skole, it really does have that active component. It's a lot more like you're already rested. Now you're getting after something that you're excited about that isn't work related, or at least isn't job related. It might be like a kind of work that you're doing, but it's a passion kind of work, right? So skole is passion-driven activity that comes from a cool, calm, and collected basis, disposition, and mode of life. Whereas otium is just like resting. Okay. It's okay to use these words interchangeably. If you're having a conversation with somebody, you don't have to get all pedantic. Like I've had pretty good conversations with people where we're talking about otium and skole and in treating them as synonymous. And I don't want to come across like a trivial pedant. And so I don't sit there and I don't like emphasize this distinction. But because this is like an actual canon lecture and like my fundamental problems and core concepts series, I did want to make sure to spell that out. Labor power is something different altogether. It's not labor. And it's not just the capacity to do labor, which is often what you'll hear from Marxists. But of course, I have also found other Marxists who are quite keen to point out it's not just the capacity to do labor. It's actually how to put this. Labor power is either a commodity or it's a socialized resource that does not need to be actualized, can just be potential. And I'll start with the capitalist example. Well, and I like to just use like a barista. Okay. And so Marx will just, Marx would just say, when people are like, wow, that barista like stands around for hours and hours, like not doing anything, because barely any people came in during all that time, yet they're being paid by the hour. And then during 1 hour, it was like really busy. And then Marx is going to say, yeah, it's not that they are being paid for their labor that they do. They're not getting paid, more money for the hours when they're doing stuff and then less money for the hours that they're not doing stuff. The point is that they are on call. They are disposed to always already being on call, to put it in a sort of Heideggerian way. They're constantly predisposed towards being on call at hand to be able to do something. It's the promise of the labor that we're getting at when we talk about labor power. It's not the literal labor that you do. It's the being on call, being at hand, having readied yourself to do the labor. But it's more than just that too, because it's never your readiness to do labor in general. And it's not just a specific kind of labor, let's say mowing lawns or being a barista. No. It's, yes, of course, it's going to be specified to some kind of specific task. But for Marx, it's very important to point out that that is measured. Your ability to do a valuable contribution within an organization concerning some kind of a task comes down to socially necessary labor time. Your labor is measured against the standard of socially necessary labor time. Socially necessary labor time means the average time that it's expected to take to do the thing, right? And so this is part of how Marx is arguing with Ricardo. And actually, Matthew Stanley recently wrote something where he engaged with Marx a little bit. And in it, he makes the mistake that thousands of economists have made when talking about Marx, and that is to critique the labor theory of value on the basis that it misses the fact that if a person takes twice as long to do something, you don't pay them twice as much. So obviously, the basis of value can't just be the labor expended. Because if it takes Alex Sappington 30 hours to mow a lawn, but it takes somebody else, 30 minutes to mow. Well, I'm not going to pay him 30 times or 60 times what I'm paying the person who took the half hour, right? And so this is a critique leveled against the labor theory of value. And typically people think of Marx as a labor theorist of value. And so then they will levy that critique against him and move on. And then they'll talk about the subjective theory of value, or they'll say, you know, what I really like about Marx, though, is this other thing that's not related to that. The thing is that in chapter 1 of volume 1 of Das Kapital, Marx critiques the labor theory of value for the exact same reason. And so the fact that you get all of these big name economists, like, let's see, who are a few? I think von Bowerk and maybe Mises, but you know, these guys like Hayek or Schumpeter or Samuelson, these economists think that they've critiqued Marx and can move on because he missed something so stupid. But what they're missing is that, no, he actually addresses this in the first chapter of his first volume of his magnum opus. And so, no, that critique that Marx is spelling out against the labor theory of value is a critique against Ricardo. And so when Joseph Schumpeter calls Marx a minor Ricardoian, he's missing the fact that Marx is this huge critic of Ricardo. But he doesn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's obviously something there. There's obviously something about labor that is that relates to the value of things, right? We don't pay for things that don't require labor. Labor is definitely one of the components of value, right? Well, it's kind of hard to narrow in on how these things relate. Well, you solve the problem, though, by bringing in the idea of socially necessary labor. Because if one person does the lawn mowing gig in a half hour, and then it takes Stabbington 30 hours to do that, well, okay. Well, what's the average time that it takes to do that lawn? Let's say that it's 45 minutes. 45 minutes is how it takes to do a lawn of that size. It'd be a pretty big lawn if it takes that long. But let's just say that it takes, you know, most people 45 minutes. The person who did it in a half hour did it in 15 minutes under the expected average socially necessary time. That is to say, labor actually done within an organization is measured against that average expectation, the socially average necessary labor time. Okay. And then when we say, well, that took you way too long to do that, we're measuring it against that standard, that idea. Okay. So if you have someone who's consistently coming in 15 minutes under, like, that's very effective, very efficient, very, very awesome worker. You might want to give that person a raise. But if they're always taking a little bit longer than is socially necessary, well, then you're not going to give that person a raise. And at some point, you might actually let them go, or you're going to set them up with some training. And if the training doesn't make them more efficient, yeah, you're just definitely not going to give them a raise, right? So this is getting at how Marx corrects for the labor theory of value. Okay. And I took all that time to explain it because you have to explain socially necessary labor time if you really want to explain labor power. Okay. Because once again, Marx is not thinking about the actual labor expended so much as the fact that you have to be ready and able on call to do the thing, right? So there are ways of expanding and elaborating on this and sort of giving expansion packs to this theory that will count for piece work or piece rate work, right? So for those who don't know, piece rate, piece work, whatever, like that's when you're paid for the amount of stuff that you actually do as opposed to by the hour. And so, like, an example of that, it's common that when you do insulation in construction, You're not paid by the hour after you're through the training phase. Once you're done with training, you're being paid piece rate. And piece rate work is to say you're paid per square foot. You get like a certain amount of money per square foot of the house that you've insulated, assuming that it's all up to code. Which means that if you work twice as hard and twice as fast, you can make twice as much money, right? And so people will use that to try to complicate this, which it does kind of complicate it, but also Marx counts for that. And so anyway, I love critiques of Marx, but I hate that most of them completely miss the kinds of things that I just pointed out, like the fact that Marx himself was a critic of the labor theory of value. He expands past it with the idea of socially necessary labor time, and he expands past it with putting labor power over and above the idea of labor. You're not just selling the labor, you're selling the capacity to do the labor, and it's not just your capacity. What makes it labor power proper is that it's a capacity to do it in a satisfactory enough way, measured up and against socially necessary labor time. To say that your life has been reduced to labor power, which is a thing that I say all the time. It's not something that you see other people say. But to say that is to say not that you've been reduced to being a laborer, because you could be unemployed for a long period of time. You could even find a way of life uh, where you actually don't have to work, right? But to say that you're reduced to labor power means you don't actually have to be working. You are, if you are generally disposed or in a general disposition defined by a regime of labor power extraction, which is not just about the extraction of labor from the populace, but is more about making the populace always modifying itself to make itself better measured up against socially necessary labor time. Hustle and grind and self-help and this whole culture of incessant improvements on oneself, where you make yourself more thrifty, you make yourself stronger, you make yourself healthier, you make yourself more efficient with your chores, and then you're bringing in multiple revenue streams, or you're learning extra skills on the weekend. All of this could be in a different context about something other than labor power, but within our context, it is fundamentally about labor power. It's about making yourself always available, ready, willing, on call, and competitive for some kind of a job. You're constantly making yourself into like an improved commodity. Now, it doesn't have to mean that, because we could live in a society that's not capitalistic and labor power could still be operative and humans could still be reduced to it, right? There's a sort of labor power realism in the young Trotsky's work. I'm not just picking on him, but he comes to mind in the moment. Where he just says, like, yeah, everyone's labor power is everything. Everything requires labor, and and you know the world he wants is one that's going out for the interests of those workers, but those workers better not be post-work or anti-work. Those workers better be still seeing themselves fundamentally as laborers. There is a way that a Marxist becomes so labor power realist, because obviously everything beautiful that we love, except for nature, does require labor, or at least human labor. You could say that nature has its own labor, but everything requires labor from humans. Everything that we want, everything that we love, everything that we take for granted. And so there's a way to be a Marxist where your realism about that forecloses any possible future where people have a life beyond that, right? This is not absolutely necessary, but it's common, is what I'm trying to say. So if you had a centrally administered socialist state where the representatives of the people, of the workers, try to keep those workers' needs and in mind while making decisions and using price controls and arranging the distribution of goods and keeping people working, you could have it be like, okay, well, let's make sure that they get time off so that they can get rested, time off so that they can get rejuvenated, have some actual time with their families, right? So they can be better culturally adjusted. Well, as Adorno says in his little piece called Free Time, that time off is still time spent in reference to labor and the clock. So this is so labor power this reduction of your life to labor power includes your hobbies, includes your vacations. Your hobbies and vacations, your weekends, are considered to be like a way of rejuvenating yourself so you can get back to work. But this realism about labor power that reduces all of life to labor power, it's an operating assumption taken up by Marx in Volume 1 of Das Kapital. He says he's going to just assume there's a basic value of socially necessary labor time. There's a basic amount of time socially necessary labor time takes. And he's going to just assume a sort of base unit of labor power in relation to that. And he's not going to think about qualified labor power, which would be like, you could think of a kind of labor power that requires a lot of education. So you could think of like a profession. Okay, but he makes other operating assumptions as well, which are totally valid, given the fact that you have to make some operating assumptions to do any theorizing. But these get picked up later as recalcitrant dogmas by many Marxists. The one I am most put off by when it's taken up as a dogma is just this reduction of everything to labor. The idea that your stomach digesting food is labor. The idea that a tree growing is labor. This is a sort of ontological reduction that brings everything down to, it can only really be seen as a form of labor or labor power. Okay. I think it's analytically, theoretically, and we'll just say heuristically useful to separate labor power from Skole. Now, academics are typically going to want to try to act like everything they do is also a form of labor. And there's this idea of intellectual labor, right? But personally, I think it's more useful to separate them. And not just useful, it might also be more real. There is necessary labor, the kind of labor necessary to make everything else in the world happen. And then there's stuff that's simply not. In this sort of reductive Marxist approach, you can say that if the economy pays for it to exist and it's a viable product or service, it's necessary. And they define necessary just by it's part of what exists in that economy at that time. But when I say necessary, I'm like saying, no, but we need metal, we need wood, we need the kinds of things that are absolute prerequisites for doing other kinds of work. We need water and food, right? The closer you get to preoccupation with necessity, and the more necessary that necessity actually is, the closer you get to what if it were to go away or stop for some reason, the whole rest of the world would really quickly become aware of. Okay, that's a sort of confounded way to say it, but basically, if if the water sanitation people were not doing their job anymore, everyone else would become aware of it really quickly. If the food wasn't coming in, obviously everyone would become aware of that very quickly. And the longer you go without water or food, the quicker you're going to kind of lose any real care or concern for those things most removed from the production of food or water, right? And so obviously, like, you could think of some middle class person who's like got a yoga studio, right? Well, nothing against a yoga studio, but after a certain point, though, you're going to realize that's not as important as getting food on the table. It's only once the food is on the table that we're able to really like, okay, what now? And only once the division of labor has made it so that certain people are preoccupied with the production of food are we able to go, oh, okay, well, we don't have to do that anymore. We've got cheap food constantly in supply. Let's do something else. And then, of course, there's gradients to how necessary some of that stuff might be. Philosophy professor is a necessary thing at a certain level for a variety of reasons. But what are those reasons? And how necessary really is it? Bourdieu's going to say that the symbolic capital that can be won in any of the scholarly fields has a power and reward that is inversely related to how necessary it is seen. The more seemingly necessary it is, the less prestigious it will be considered, right? Okay, so I want to close this out pretty soon, and I need to reiterate a couple of points. But basically, I wanted to say, yeah, so we've got labor power over here and Skole over there. Skole is only possible because most people's lives have been reduced to labor power. And both of these presuppose and rely on time energy, which is large energy infused, repeatable blocks of time. Now, I have in some cases said cool, calm, and collected energy, but I think that when I say that, I am more like just using time energy synonymously with Skole. You know, it's Skole that is the kind of time and energy that you have reliably available, free of pressure. It's cool, calm, and collected. You're able to get after the things that you're passionate about. But time energy as the precondition for Skole and labor power is really just the fact that you as a human being have a daily allotment, a weekly allotment, a monthly average of non-separated time and energy, where you have time that is filled with energy. You have time that is not exhausted, right? To reduce that to labor power means that, yeah, you still kind of have time energy. It's just so instrumentalized, everything has become about attenuating and calibrating and leveling up oneself vis-a-vis socially necessary labor time. It's a complete and constant preoccupation with efficiency and competitiveness. It's not free from being preoccupied by those social or economic kinds of necessity. And what I've been trying to say is that white collar workers, professionals and managers, and professors, especially academics or scholars, all today have tremendous social and economic pressures. And a lot of those come from the kinds of funding sources I was talking about earlier. The National Endowment for the Arts, right? The National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and all of their subsidiaries, as well as the subsidiaries to the military industrial complex that sort of launder their dark interests, putting out research grants available for people looking into this or that, and then those objective criteria filter out people who are trying to think beyond the confines of those powers that be. So yeah, you have a lot of academics today who think they have this privilege of leisure time, but they don't really, because they are preoccupied by the interests of others that are fundamentally based in political, economic, and social stresses, pressures, goals, etc. Not only that, I already said that those powers that be used to understand that the best work comes from people who've been freed from those preoccupations, from those occupations with necessary labor. Yep, but that's been lost. So the heart, soul, and fundamental basis of school, in the word skole, its dignity, nobility, true meaning has been lost. And that means the poor little academics and professors everywhere are just selling themselves to these powers that be, and they don't even realize it. And those who have earnestly inquiring minds, those who are the most intellectually curious and who love to research for its own sake, might have a very hard time fitting their own square peg in the round hole of the Ford Foundation, right? That mismatch between the shape of your genuine interests and their interests, this square peg round hole mismatch, is, I'm going to say it, the basis of what a lot of people have diagnosed themselves as, or have been diagnosed as ADHD. You can't force yourself into the round hole, so you are just interested in other things. So you can't really sit still. You're not able to fit yourself into that. And so then they think that you're a distraction. They think of you as squirmy. They think of you as distracted. And so they put you on Ritalin or Adderall. You can't force yourself to attenuate your labor power into a qualified version of labor power that would make you a competitive applicant for some kind of more prestigious or high paying position. And so you take Adderall so that you can earn better grades by forcing yourself to stay focused on the things they want you to be interested in. Staying focused requires devotion if it's going to be a work of passion, a work of love. But staying focused can be done without devotion if you are able to just force yourself to do the little dance that you're supposed to do for them. If you're able to force yourself to, as you're looking for a research grant that could make it so that you're able to secure or maintain a position within the academy, force your own interests to align with its interests, right? So you just want to read Pascal, but because all of the research grants from the Ford Foundation are about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're sitting here trying to figure out, how can I write something about Pascal that also works for their big social justice demands related to DEI? I got to be able to find a way here. Maybe I could talk about the habitus of whiteness of being Pascal, I mean, like, literally, this is the kinds of shit you see. That doesn't mean that the insights or truths revealed within the academy are any less insightful or true, but it does also explain how kind of ridiculous you see some of the stuff that they're doing how ridiculous it actually is, you know. They're putting themselves through these contortions because they have these genuine sort of interests, but because they're not able to cultivate those interests directly, but instead have to preoccupy themselves with these external pressures and expectations, basically rooted in social and economic necessity, they're not able to have the Skole to be able to read the people who did. Pascal, though he was suffering, he had Skole compared to any professor today. Nietzsche, though he was suffering, had Skole. Obviously, Plato and Aristotle had their Skole. Augustine, Aquinas had their Skole, right? Marcus Aurelius. Okay. Once you get to the Stoic philosophers, it's this big question mark. Did they really have Skole? I don't know if they really had Skole. But that's also maybe why Stoicism is so much more simplistic than most other philosophies. You know, it's a much more limited scope of philosophical thinking than most other philosophies. And that's, you know, Marcus Aurelius was an emperor and Epictetus was a slave. And so they're two of the greatest thinkers of Stoicism. They obviously had big time expectations, obligations, social and economic pressures, right? But that's the segue into this bigger question of what it is that we're doing and what it means to be a round peg trying to fit yourself into a square hole. And I attacked that idea first with homework in my last seminar. But here, talking about Skole versus school, the real question is, for those of us who have no possibility of Skole on our horizon of possibilities, but who nonetheless hunger and thirst after knowledge, wisdom, who want to research truth, who want to pursue understanding, who want to delve deeper into the ideas of the good, the beautiful, the just, and the true, what are we supposed to do? Is it not the blind leading the blind if we are surrounded by people who should be able to mentor us, but their own habitus is the habitus of someone who's never actually had Skole? They've just learned how to talk like people who used to have Skole. Is that not the blind leading the blind? Then I think, well, what about if we just kind of bracket them out a little bit, maybe put them into suspension a little bit, and instead just focus on communion with these great minds who did have their Skole? Or what if we just focus on getting freed from economic and social conditions so that we can then have our Skole? This is where people are completely baffled by the idea that I want to be helping on the farm where I currently am. Why would I want to be helping on the farm if I could just be doing Theory Underground full time? And this is where we get into the fundamental disagreement between me and the anti-work theorists of time energy. Anti-work theorists of time energy think that the only real goal of a time energy theory should be for full automation and a universal basic income, so that everyone can be free to just live a passion-driven life. And I'm going to say, even if full automation and a universal basic income were possible, there's a lot of economic and engineering-based sort of ideas and works arguing that this would not work out. Even if it could work out, let's just assume that it could. Is Skole, in this traditional sense, actually the goal? Does it actually need to be the goal? I think that for thinkers like Lukács and Gramsci and Pierre Bourdieu, the answer is not to try to get everybody to a place where they then have full Skole all the time. That this is not only a utopian idea, but that it's also a very convenient comfortable, thought terminating, problem evading kind of idea for people who want to live in a fantasy where, oh, well, we could all just be free of that stuff. Never mind the fact that your current way of life, as busy as it might be, is still predicated on a lot of people doing way shittier work that you'll never actually have to confront. You would have to go to the Congo and see it with your own bare eyes and actually develop relationships with people there to truly understand what it means. You'd have to go to actual, Southeast Asian sweatshops and factories with barbed wire around the walls, keeping people in, to really see what necessary labor means for keeping this world running today. Right? It's one thing to say that you want everyone to have good lives. It's another thing for your whole life to kind of just reduce to basically being like, well, I just want to have my time, energy, and look, I want everyone to have it. Okay. In the meantime, you think that all labor could be replaced by automation? Really? Because who's gonna fix the robots? Right? Who's gonna be doing the engineering in the meantime? Right? This anti-work approach to time energy theory takes the aristocratic, luxurious ideal of Skole, turns it into a sacred god that everyone is supposed to kneel at and worship. And if everyone doesn't want that way of life, well, then that's just false consciousness. They're just duped by ideology. They just don't really want freedom. And what's being excluded, I think, is the possibility of a different mode of life. One where you can have your Skole in a sort of sense, but also not. Maybe I say, have your Skole and eat it too, right? It's a way of bringing together the life of the mind and the work of the hands. I think what we're doing as workers with earbuds is not just reacting to our situation. I think we are actively pioneering a new mode of life. One where we can tend the machines that need our attention, one where we can tend the machines that need constant maintenance. Those machines do the majority of the shittiest work, but we tend those while listening to edifying content, to put it in a totally vulgar sense, or to put it in a much more, I think, dignified way, to say, listening to great lectures, listening to great theoretical or literary works, right? We can listen to stuff while doing things. And there'll be a lot of people who say that doesn't work for them. Yeah, well, it turns out most people have trouble reading in the first place today. Even people who are supposedly good at reading can't read the kinds of stuff that we care about. And if they did, they would struggle with it. Real reading is a struggle. And it's no less true when it comes to listening. Because really, it is about serving, respecting, ennobling the kinds of interests that you have, which constantly are going to be set against those who are trying to try to distract you from what you care about. Those who are going to try to tell you that you should be focused on something else. For people trying to find a lifestyle that will work for them, where they can have their Skole and exist within the institutions, you're going to have to be able to square some kind of a circle, fit some kind of circular interest into their square hole, right? But for those of us who are literally freed from the mental obligations of intellectual labor, who are only doing manual labor, we're actually a lot more free to read, to think, and to do so in a sort of unbounded way. Which is not only why I'm against taking too seriously the obligations or expectations of the academy today. I went into a whole bunch of the different reasons for that at my last seminar, institutional capture and versus genuine thinking. No, it goes, I think, much deeper into we don't even know what a human can do yet. We don't even know what humanity is capable of. Why would we restrict ourselves to an old model that guesses there must be this rigid binary between those who think and those who do? So I'm obviously not against automation. I obviously want people to have more time, energy at their disposal for something that's not just reducing themselves to labor power. But what I'm challenging is the supreme ideal of Skole that gets taken to such an extreme that one allows their thinking to get captured by the goals of anti-work, which is a reification and projection of an old mode, an old mode of production and its old relations of production. I think that there's a couple of things that I'll say to sort of wrap up several of the threads here, but at this point, I'm actually going to say let's first check in and see if anybody present has anything that you want to ask a question for clarity on, or just a thought that's been popping into your head that you think you might want to share.
Hi. Yeah, maybe I'll just say, I mean, I work in academia in a scientific field, so what you said hits very close to home. And definitely I can see the crisis of academia nowadays. It's become less and less a place for like genuine curiosity, like conversations, and all of the problems. I relate to all of the problems you mentioned, essentially. Also the fact that I feel like it's very individualistic nowadays. At the end of the day, if you want to progress in academia, it's you and your name. And Timenergy is something that it's shared between us in a sense. And I don't know, it's not great. So yes, I relate a lot.
Thanks, Federico.
I'm really interested in this book by Bourdieu. I was interested in Pascal for a moment because I was reading the Russian philosopher Lev Shestov. He has an essay called Gethsemane Night on Pascal's philosophy. And one thing he mentions actually that we could kind of relate to this idea of Pascal being a minor figure is how some minds are kind of discarded by the canon and we can take them seriously. And so it looks like Bourdieu did and came up with some new ideas from that. So I'm definitely interested in that book.
Yeah, it actually was kind of a cool thing that a lot of the French thinkers from around that time were doing was taking these thinkers that are seemingly a bit more obscure and in showing how relevant they still are. And so like Deleuze does this with a whole bunch of people, but most famously, he's bringing Spinoza back, in a world where everyone just cares about Hegel or Marx. He's like actually Spinoza though, right? And so that's the thing about the canon is that every one of the obscure thinkers in the canon is only arguably obscure because um, the trends of our time make people think that other figures from the canon have so much more to say to us. But then people who are looking around who aren't impressed with the main sexy thinkers to cite will usually go rummaging through the canon and find somebody who they can then show has staying power. And that's why I said it's arguable that they still speak to us, because the canon itself, the way that I use the term, is not a thing, but an argument, right? It's a process of argumentation about who has staying power for us today. So whenever people start arguing with me about, well, is it really a canon? Or what about if there's canons? What if there's a lot of different canons? Or what if we don't need a canon anymore? It's just, or like, do you really think that these old books matter? Well, I just defined it as an argument. So you are engaging in the argument with me, and you're proving that that my definition of the word actually is real. But what you're arguing against is this idea that it's some very limited collection of old books, right? And so for me, the canon is not a collection of old books, though it is an argument about which old books have staying power. And of course, people can't be in that argument if they're not based in the canon, which is why I agree with Nick Land when he was in conversation with me and Anne earlier this year on What's Right, when he was saying, even though he, he's always been a critic of the AOE, the architectonic order of the eschaton, the maintainers of order and civilization. He nonetheless has gained more respect for the AOE, and he wishes that he had a more AOE based education when he was younger, right? Which is to say, yeah, he might still prefer chaos and disorder and newness, but at the end of the day, he wishes that he'd had a good classical education. And yeah, because it's on the basis of the canon that you're able to argue with the canon. A basis on the canon is not being grounded in Latin and Greek and a bunch of old books. It's instead being introduced to the arguments about those books, which obviously also, if it's a good education, would require reading those books, which would not mean just learning mathematical formulae, but would also include reading Euclid for yourself, which would not just mean memorizing and regurgitating Newtonian principles of physics. No, it would be reading Newton, right? And then of course also being introduced to the arguments around the reception of his work. And so yeah, I think the sort of final note I wanted to use to close this all up, I have it written down here in my lecture notes. It was kind of like the sort of hidden theme of everything, is the idea of new reading or post reading, or how to read everything. At some lecture or seminar that I gave at the beginning of this year, I think I said that I'm going to show everybody how to read all the books, or like 100 books, or I forget exactly how I said it. I know that I said it without a whole lot of elaboration. It could be taken as a pretentious thing or as a kind of ostentatious goal, but I mean it from the bottom of my heart. I think that what's going on today is that people feel encumbered or restricted by this ever-growing pile of books that they are supposed to have read. People feel completely crippled by the burden of this giant pile of books that just seems to grow and grow and grow and get heavier and heavier and heavier. And then you realize how little you know, and you realize how much there is, because you read a couple of things deeply, and that leaves you with like, oh my God, I got so much just from those books. Like, how much more would I get from all those other books? But I don't have the time, energy to read those books. So what am I supposed to do? Right? And so there's a fundamental problem here that comes from the way that we've been schooled to think about books and Skole, or in some sense, maybe in how we've been schooled to not think about Skole, right? And so we hold ourselves to standards that were proper to people who had Skole when we don't have it. And arguably, it would require a very unjust world for a lot more people to have their Skole. It'd probably be a world that looks a lot like the Hunger Games. You know, you want to be like districts 1 or 2 in the Hunger Games and have your Skole so that all the other districts can stay preoccupied with all of the other less noble, more dirty, risky, and shitty kinds of work that are necessary. And what I'm proposing is that there's another way of living. There's another way of learning. There's another way of reading. That if we can find it, if we can hone in on it, if we can, as intellectual working researchers at pioneering new frontiers of what it is to be human and new modes of working, living, thinking. Well, I think we'll be able to free ourselves from those burdens, not just by changing the expectations, which would be raisonnement. Pure raisonnement gives yourself intellectual or moral superiority, okayness, or relief just by changing the value frameworks that you live in relation to, that you measure yourself up against, that you measure the world up against, right? And so it would be pure raisonnement to say, well, we can't read books, and so not the way people used to read books, so we won't. We just don't believe in reading books that way anymore. We don't believe that, and not only do we not believe that, but we'll be better intellectuals and potentially even more moral as human beings for not doing that. That would be pure raisonnement. But with that admitted, and maybe even with that as a sort of caution or a red flag, I still think it's possible to develop a new way of reading, one that circumnavigates our current deadlocks. And so I meant to close off with an example of that. This morning, I listened to multiple chapters of Jeff Schmidt's Disciplined Minds and multiple chapters of Pierre Bourdieu's Pascalian Meditations. I woke up at 5 a.m. I started listening to those books. I would pause. I would make notes. I would do a little research on Google, but also I just drove a lot. I drove all the way, I drove 45 minutes one direction, took a break, chilled for a while, and then drove home. And on that drive, pulled over a couple times. And also took care of some things on the farm, took care of the chickens, went up on the roof of the studio that's being built and fixed the tarp that was out of place. I did that stuff while listening to these books. And that was not my first time doing this. I've gone back to these books a lot of times. I have literally gone back to these books almost every time I've thought about them. The first times I listened to them on Speechify, I pulled the PDFs off of Anna's archive. I put them into Speechify. I listened to them when I was working. I don't know, it's probably years ago, the first time. I listened to them all the way through without interruption, really, while I was working at Amazon. I was doing what's considered one of the shittier jobs in America. And I was working, in some cases, 12-hour shifts, just listening. I wasn't taking deep notes. I wasn't stopping every time I got confused about a word. I wasn't rereading a paragraph when I realized my mind had wandered. I just let it flow through me, wash over me, like Deleuze and Guattari say at the beginning of 1,000 Plateaus. I was reading like I was listening to a record. They said that they see a future where people are going to read like they're listening to records. They had no idea that workers with earbuds at Amazon would be literally listening to them say that, letting it wash over them like it's music. But that's right. I was listening to it like it was music. I wasn't overly instrumentalizing it, trying to ask myself, well, how does what I'm listening to fit into my project? Pascalian Meditations fits into my project perfectly. Well, guess what? I listened to hundreds of other books while I was there. Hundreds of other books. I was paid to do manual labor while I snuck the earbud under my bandana because you're not allowed to have the earbud. I would sneak it. And I was able to learn a ton of stuff, but it was in a non-instrumentalized way. I wasn't sitting there going, how am I going to turn this into something useful for Theory Underground? How am I going to turn this into something useful for a master's thesis? How am I going to turn this into something useful so I can publish it in an academic journal or in my big book? I mean, okay, the book part, I guess I always have that question. And of course, everything does relate back to Timenergy. But because I had this idea of Skole, I also am just like, no, I just want to like listen to it curiously, listen to it, let it wash over me. And when I'm distracted, assume the reason I'm distracted is because what I'm listening to isn't as important as what I'm thinking about as what is distracting me. Now, obviously, sometimes you get distracted by things that really are insignificant. They really don't matter. They're really a pure distraction. It's like something you're thinking about some drama, or you're thinking about some chore that you're supposed to do, or you're just whatever. Yeah, you get distracted by dumb shit all the time. In which case, then you can always skip back and re-listen to sections that you were distracted while listening to. But also, this new approach to reading nonfiction, specifically nonfiction, is also kind of just it's kind of like throwing it at the wall and seeing what sticks. You're just absorbing it and seeing what sticks with you. After the fact is usually when you're going to realize something from what you're listening to matters. Usually it's like way after the fact that I realize what was going on in that book. And sometimes I'm wrong, right? Sometimes I think, oh, this is what's really going on in that book. So then I go back to that book and then I realize, oh, okay, that's not true. It's actually this other thing. But it's about going back over and a new mentality about going over texts that loosens up what it's going to be used for, loosens up trying to capture and make knowledge out of every single bit of it. And instead, just like, okay, I'm listening to a really long podcast by some great thinker giving a monologue, and I've been invited to listen in. And if I get distracted by something, cool, I can go back over it, or maybe I won't. But ultimately, the most freeing thing about this is that I'm not bound to only listening. None of us are bound to only listening or watching YouTube videos. It's like people kind of assume, well, there's book people, there's YouTube people, there's audiobook people. No, I think new reading is hybrid. I think new reading is about learning how to listen to stuff and then always find what mattered later and then go back to it, go back over it, right? And so, yeah, I guess I've always had like this very limiting ideal based in Skole of what a scholarly life is. And this, oh, I wish that I could be like that. I wish that I could just go and post up at the coffee shop for 6 hours every day. And I could just read and take notes and read and take notes and sip on my cappuccino. And then eventually I would write pieces that would draw off of all of that reading. And then I'd be able to show people that I have a great contribution to make. And I say it kind of like it's a cartoon, but our fantasies are cartoonistic. Our fantasies are like, if you think of like a fantasy, a lot of times it's like kind of someone else's fantasy. Your deeper fantasies are literally your daydreams. If you catch yourself daydreaming about something, it's usually not something that you would tell other people about. It's because it's kind of childish. It's kind of like a cartoon, right? And so it's only like in hindsight, after some serious socioanalysis, deconstructing my own sort of fantasies, that I've been able to go, oh, like I really was putting that way of life on this pedestal and measuring my actually existing life against that. When in reality, I think at this point, I can go, no, man, I'm not only doing a lot, but I'm also thinking deeply. I'm not only doing a lot, I'm also capable of getting through the great books that actually have something to say about the stuff that I'm working on. If someone recommends a book to me, I've usually listened to at least a half hour of it within 2 hours of them making that recommendation, if I respect them, or if I thought the conversation I was having with them was worthwhile. Which is to say, if any of you in the sort of closing of this lecture had been like, oh, well, this book really comes to mind as useful for this or for that, it has something to say about this or about that, I don't like put it on my list and then think about buying it. And I don't go buy it and then it arrives a week later and then I don't think about it ever again. It just sits on the shelf. You know, maybe I do think about it in that I feel guilty about not reading it. No, I go while talking to them, usually, while still in the conversation. I download it off Anna's archive, queue it up in Speechify, and the moment the conversation's ended, the phone call, the Zoom call, the IRL meetup, whatever it is, the moment it's over and I'm walking away, I'm listening to the introduction of that book. And usually, by the time I arrive at my next destination, I've gotten through the foreword, preface, or introduction, and I now know enough about the book and the author's voice or mode to know if it's worth going back to for any of the things I'm currently thinking about. And even if I think not, the chances are a month, 3 months to a year later, it might pop back up in my mind as like, oh, that's that. I need to go back to that book. I was looking into that book and it didn't really seem to fit what I was working on at the time. But like, I'm gonna go back and check it out, and then I'll like queue it up and listen to it, and then oh, okay, I thought it was about this, but it's actually about that. Whatever, that kind of contradiction, contrast, and comparison, that sort of whether it does match up to what you're currently passionate about or not, like it's basically like dating polyamorously with books, right? You're basically like, oh, every book is worth at least a first date. It's just nowadays I'm not going to actually go to a coffee shop and sit there for hours with the date. I'm going to instead have a phone call with the date. That's what listening to a book is like. It's not like, oh, now I know the book. It's just like opening my mind to like, okay, but what's here? All of this is to say there's an approach that humans now have at their disposal between PDFs, audio files, and actual physical texts, which I'm still a big fan of, and I still read, digital note taking, and then physical note taking, where it's never an either or in a sense where it's mutually exclusive. You have to make a decision, take a side, and now you're forever going to be that one kind of reader. There's a new kind of hybrid reading that actually can oscillate between all of these different modes and is probably, I'm just going to say it, going to be especially useful for the ADHD people who, as I was saying, have rebellious attention spans that can't be forced like that square peg into the round hole, right? Or I think I was saying round peg, square hole, whichever, doesn't really matter. So I want the whole Skole versus school question to not just get us to think deeper about the things we feel bad about, the things, the expectations we hold ourselves up to, the weird professional field standards we've internalized, the Skole modes of life that are unobtainable yet we aspire towards, or like use that as a critique of actually existing schools. All great, all good, but more importantly, as a basis upon which to ask a deeper question about what are the possibilities for a new mode? What are the possibilities for a new kind of reading, a new kind of writing, a new kind of thinking, one that humans did not have access to previously? What are the possibilities for entirely new modes of life, modes of relations of production, modes of production? We're going to be going into Marx with Benjamin's intro to political theorists class pretty soon here. And that is what it's all about, is the mode of production is always fundamental. And the relation of production is on the basis of that mode. And those relations of production, whether worker or owner, boss, manager, professional, whatever, your position within a field, your occupation of a position within a field, and the degree to which you are supposed to focus on social or economic necessity, that defines everything about your mode of life. Well, if that's all true, the technology being where it is today means we really can do stuff that no one's ever been able to do, and that the categories Marx was thinking with and using to describe his situation might not be the categories that are most helpful for thinking about what we are capable of as we project ourselves onto the horizon of possibilities. So let's not be projecting round holes onto a square horizon. I kind of hate this metaphor. I've kind of beaten it to death, but you get the idea. So it is also about reprojection, which is one of the talks I gave in this series. When looking back to great thinkers, texts, and concepts from the canon or in the canon, which is to say the argument about those great thinkers and texts, the big question is, how do they inform how we're projecting ourselves onto the horizon of possibilities? Well, if it's informing us by making us project out ahead of ourselves more of the same, as opposed to helping us deconstruct ourselves from that past so that we're opened up to something new, well, then I think that that's going to stultify our thinking. It's going to stultify our possibilities. It's going to foreclose everything that we're capable of here. And that there's a lot more, there's a lot more for us. And specifically when I say us, I don't just mean workers with earbuds, because if you're here and you're like Federico and you're an academic and you're surrounded by academics and you're aware that these are problems, there's new possibilities for you as well, right? One of the big questions, as I've put it this year, is it's not just about people like us, the people with the rebellious attention spans who couldn't force ourselves to do the things we were supposedly supposed to be doing. It's also about figuring out how to work with those who are deep, insightful thinkers or theorists actually existing today, or whose works exist with us still long after they've been dead, right? The real question is, how do we work together? How do we learn together? What are the new modes of comportment available for us today? All right, and with that, I'm going to close this out. We're going to get ready for the next thing, but I really appreciate you all. Thank you, everybody. This has been great. Take care.